Welcome to Conversations at the Crossroads of Leadership and Flourishing. Over the last couple of months, we have been talking all things collaboration, why it's good, why it's hard, what we need to do it well, and have had some really incredible people with us. But this month, I'm super excited to introduce you to Eric. Eric Swanson is going to be with us this month to have the conversation. And Eric has this long history in leadership and in leadership collaboration and engagement out in the community. And so he, I think, spent about 25 years with Crew, over 20 years with the Leadership Network, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so just a long history in ministry, loving people, engaging out in the world. And I'd love, Eric, for you to tell us a little bit more about just what you're doing now, and even what is interesting to you, or what would drive an interest or a passion for collaboration for you.
Great question, Ruth. I first got involved in this area. My background was with 25 years of Campus Crusade, and Campus Crusade is what we now call Crew. But it's very evangelistic, and we're always about leading people to Christ and making disciples and multiplying disciples. And that mission, has captured me actually for the last 50 years. In 2001, I started working with a group called Leadership Network out of Dallas, Texas, started by a guy named Bob Buford. Some of the viewers or listeners might be familiar with Bob, but he wrote a book called Halftime, and the subtitle was From Success to Significance. But Leadership Network also had two branches. They had a church innovation branch, then they had this halftime group of people that had been successful the first half of their life, now wanted to kind of give themselves to significance for the kingdom. On the church innovation side, they were just starting with something they call it a urban church network. And I said, I'm probably not your guy, but I could probably find the guy to lead that. But in the meantime, discovered a group of churches that were just thinking differently about what church was, and that they were measuring their effectiveness not by how many people they could bring in a sanctuary on a Sunday morning, but by the transformational effect that they were having on the community. And it wasn't bound by denomination or location. Actually, with Ruth, one of the first churches I found was Perimeter in Atlanta, but another church down in Jacksonville, Florida, another church up in Portland, Oregon, another one in Irvine, California, another one here in Longmont, where I live. And when I asked these leaders, I said, well, who are you learning from? And they'd all, almost to a person, say, well, as far as I know, we're the only ones that are thinking this way. And so the Leadership Network model was to bring churches from, to take innovation that was on the edges and help make that the new norm. And so by bringing these churches together, gosh, I guess I'm not as crazy as I thought I was, because you guys are doing it too. What can we learn from you? And the whole collaborative learning space was really good. So I did a number of groups with those, ended up writing a book with a friend of mine called The Externally Focused Church. And what naturally evolved was that churches were seeing significance, and other churches would say, well, could we join you in what you're doing? And I know in my own church here in Colorado, we mobilized, not a very big church, about 1,000, but we had 700 people one weekend, and we refurbished an elementary school, middle school, and high school, and then had a big picnic and celebration. Well, next year, 3 churches joined us. Next year, 14. Next year, 36. And pretty soon, we were taking on as a project for a weekend, Friday afternoon, Saturday, and Sunday, the celebration Sunday afternoon. Most of the schools from Boulder, Colorado to North Denver. And so when churches start working together and they say, well, we're already working with schools, these businesses want to help us. And so when churches start working with other churches and then working with businesses and schools, those become sort of the basis for city transformation networks that hopefully become movements. So that's captured me. So back in 2003, 2004, I had the ability to, and the budget, to bring together people that were thinking this way, not just in the United States, but actually from around the world. And so a friend of mine, Sam Williams, with whom I then wrote another book called To Transform a City, Whole Church, Whole Gospel, Whole City. And if I wanted to add to that now, I'd say it's the whole church, not going to include every church, but can't exclude any church, taking the whole gospel in word and deed to the whole person, body, soul, and spirit in the whole city, every sector, public, social, private, in every domain. Just called the channels of cultural influence in the city.
Yes, and it's yeah, learning from each other, and it's I think incredible to see how God is working in different cities, and it's like there's uniqueness in how it manifests, and then also a lot of similarity because people are people and God is God, and so anyways, it has been such a gift, and I feel like from your position, you get like this front row seat to see God at work in so many different places. And just a few minutes ago, you were talking about like not measuring just butts and seats, but the transformational effect that the church was having on communities, right? And I would love for you to kind of describe what have you seen happen in cities where churches and others, maybe other sectors of the community, are collaborating together?
You know, I like the way that you phrase that question, Ruth, because sometimes we think, you know, the work of God can only be accomplished by, you know, fully dedicated, fully consecrated believers. But the miracle of God is, the wonder of God is that He uses all sorts of people to do His work. And I think of, and that's the beauty of it. How I think the most impact we can have is not when the church does something in isolation and has a T-shirt that says, you know, such and such church serving the last, the least, and the lost. That separates us from them. And I came across the concept early on. It was super helpful. I was describing what we were doing, and a friend of mine who I was just getting to know, a guy named Steve Hawthorne, who leads something called Waymakers Ministry, but it's a very vibrant kind of prayer walking ministry in the city. And Steve said, "Oh, you're talking about the difference between a centered set and a bounded set." And I said, "Well, tell me more. What does that mean?" He said, "Well, it was discovered by a guy named Paul Hebert, a theologian who used to teach at, I think, Trinity and Fuller. But he described the difference between a centered set and a bounded set. And he said a bounded set was, he said, up until the time of the Reformation, there was only one church, and you couldn't just kind of hold a Bible study, you know, or start another church because you know people were burned at the stake for kind of having their own thoughts. I said, but with the Reformation came the right and responsibility for people to decide themselves what God has to say. And so, but soon Lutheran churches began separating from other Lutheran churches, Reformed, Reformed, et cetera, et cetera. And so he described it as a circle about a set, and the ability to work together would be if each of the dots in that circle represents a different doctrine. What do you believe about baptism? Is it a sign of conversion, or is it a sign of a covenant for a young child? What do you believe about spiritual gifts? What do you believe about salvation? What do you believe about all these different things? And in the old days, when I first started doing this, for church to get together to work with anybody, they had to sign this doctrinal statement, you know, because whoever not with us is against us, kind of thing. And by the way, that's interesting because the city movements are built around one or two verses contradictory that Jesus both said. One place he said, "Who's ever not for us is against us," and in another place he says, "Whoever isn't against me is with me." And so city movements are built on one of those two verses. And I would tend to say, who's ever not against us is for us. Everyone that wants to make life better in any of those ways that lead to human flourishing is really on our side. And so the bounded set is the ability to work together. Do you believe like I believe? That if we do, then we work together. Hebert said, and so he said in evangelism, that's what denominations are. He said there's another way of thinking about conversion and salvation and growth and stuff like that. He says it's not he says instead of a circle, it's a dot. And he says that dot represents Jesus. He said either people are moving towards Jesus or moving away from Jesus. He says it's actually better to be far away but moving towards Jesus than be next to Jesus moving away. So it's not, so he says, are people moving towards Jesus or moving away from Jesus? And then we take that same concept and then instead of putting Jesus at the center, put what we care about as believers. And so again, it's the question isn't do you believe the quality the qualification for working together is not do you believe like I believe or like we believe, but do you care about what we care about? So who in the city cares about homelessness? Who cares about single moms? Who cares about underperforming school children? Who cares about kids in the foster care system? And in reality, um, a city movement is actually a collection of centered sets. And each of those sets doesn't need to be necessarily led by a church, because God has raised up people of goodwill to work together with people of good faith to change things that we commonly care about. And you see that throughout the Bible, that God used people of goodwill to accomplish His will, just as He did as much as good faith. So, I think of a couple examples of that with, Cyrus, for example, did more for the repatriation to Jerusalem than anybody else, and he was not a believer. But God says He's a tool in my hand to do my will. And so why would people, we think of these secular people, oh, they're just do-gooders, they're trying to work their way to heaven. No, but what if God puts in their heart that they really care about trafficking? They really care about foster care. And you come across these amazing people in the city, and they don't even know why they're so passionate about redeeming something that's broken. And by the way, I think that becomes a great channel for having a spiritual conversation. I remember several years ago, I was speaking at Denver University, a local university here, to a class on nonprofit management. And I said, do you ever wonder why you self-selected to go into nonprofit work when you'd be making so much more money if you went into business? And all the people, they kind of grumbled. And I said, I think it's because you're created in God's image. And one of the things we're to be like God in, it says we're to be merciful as your Heavenly Father's merciful. And you are merciful people. And I think that's because God's working in you. Now, not necessarily everyone became Christians that day, but all of them got big smiles on their face because, sort of like having the ability to connect their small story with what God wants done in the world. And I mean, isn't it amazing to you, Ruth, how for everything that's broken in the world, God's put in the heart of somebody to be part of that redemptive story. And they don't need to be Christian to do so. That you just wonder why anyone would want to be a hospice worker, or anyone would want to be a dentist for that matter, looking, prying into people's dirty mouths, or all those things you just never want to do. But when you ask those people, I remember one time I used that illustration of a hospice worker, and this woman in the front row, she raised her hand. She goes, well, I'm a hospice worker. And I felt totally humiliated. But I said, do you like your job? She goes, I love my job. So one thing I would not want to do, that'd be the last thing I'd want to do, was the first thing she wanted to do. And so now, and by the way, having that mindset is so important, because now we can look at people for the value that they bring to the world, not just as an introduction to having a spiritual conversation, because sometimes in evangelism, it's just connecting their small story to God's big story. And I even think that if they believe that something's not the way it's supposed to be, and that somebody can do something to make it better, they understand 2/3 of the gospel message. Life isn't what it's supposed to be, and yet somebody can do something about it, like Jesus did something for it. Now, how do we close that loop? So it's having that mindset then is that we can tell people, if we can make that connection, how God is using them as a teacher or a doctor, or I think one of the tasks would be for people that are involved in city work is to look at every profession in the city and ask themselves or study it to the point of being a near expert on it, of how why this is important, what God wants done in the world. So our evangelistic questions don't begin with, Jesus is your Lord and Savior, but do you ever think about how your job is that you're a tool in God's hands? What do you mean? Well, I'm a trash collector. Man, you're keeping disease out of the city, and you just have, and being able to connect in something eternal, I think is a real gift that we could have. And I think that's really an underdeveloped area that we can all get better at.
Yep. And even to that extent, I've found, of course, there are Christians within churches who are social workers, who are teachers, who are all those things. But often also I've found we've tried to create sort of a Christian version of a lot of things. And we think that because we love Jesus and we love the Bible, that we are experts in being able to sort of execute in all those areas. And I've just learned as I've gotten to know so many cool partners and leaders in the cities I've lived in of like, wow, this person doesn't know Jesus, but they know how to teach, or this person doesn't know Jesus, but they know how to navigate housing and the housing market. And there's a lot I could learn from them. And
Well, that's
yeah,
that's a
so
great statement you just said, Ruth. There's a lot I can learn from them, and people get that. Whether you come on as the expert and a little bit condescending, or what can I learn from you? What do you know that I don't know that would help me do my job better? And that's who you are, by the way, Ruth. You know that. But if that would spread, that would just be a little more curious and a little more teachable. I think would really be helpful.
that's good. Okay, so on that note, so there's there's that angst or the challenge of partnering with people who maybe different denominations or even who are not Christians. I think another thing that can come up with that is there's this like sort of impetus, like I need to be able to, if I'm doing something in the community, it has to involve sort of a verbal gospel proclamation. I have to share the gospel. And I think sometimes even that's some of the hang up is sort of like, well, I can't partner with this person who doesn't believe the same gospel as I do in sharing the gospel, right? Or that kind of a thing. And I'm just curious where you're at, because of course, 25 years with Crew, and a significant part, I'm sure, of your time was spent verbally sharing the gospel, right? So,
Yeah,
right,
whether they wanted me to or not.
right.
Yeah. So I think one of the things that helped me out, my friend Sam Williams one day blurted out, who I wrote to Transform City with, but he said that in service, he said evangelism is our ultimate motive, but can never be our ulterior motive. And I've used that line a whole lot because like an ulterior motive means I'm doing this so that I can share the gospel with you, so that you will come to Christ. And today people sniff that out right away, and you can just Google it. Why are Christians being so nice or whatever. And instead, it needs to be much more like it is our ultimate motive. It's like Paul when he was preaching or he's just telling a story to Agrippa, and Agrippa interrupts him and says, "In a short time, you're going to convince me to become a Christian." Paul didn't back down and say, "Oh, I'm sorry, was I being too pushy?" He said, "Not only you, Agrippa, but also everyone that's in my hearing, I wish as I were." So that's his ultimate motive is that like God doesn't desire for any to perish, but for all to come to repentance. But um, but at the same, so do we want people to come to Christ? Absolutely. So if you were partnering with a school and doing after school tutoring, or you're sending volunteers to help kids read at third grade level, which is the most determinative thing, as you know, about the person's future from at least a human point of view. Um, I suppose, well, as the principal said, well, I suppose now you want all of us to become Christians and start going to your church. The correct answer is absolutely, because there's nothing better than having a personal relationship with the living God and be involved in a community that's changing the world. However, if none of you ever darkens the door of our church, or none of you ever prays the sinner's prayer, comes to Christ, we're not going to stop doing what we're doing, because we do this not to make you Christian, but we do this because we are Christian. We don't do this to convert, but we do this because we are converted. And if you look at, you and I have been both for this last couple of months exploring around the three greats, the great commandment, love God, love your neighbors, yourself, and the great commission, go make disciples of all the nations, and the great compassion, Matthew 25, when I was hungry, you gave me something to eat. When I was thirsty. And that seems to be an actual question that God's going to ask. He says at that day, people are going to he's going to, when did you do that? It's not a parable. He says on that day, this is going to happen. And so these are going to be actual questions that God's going to ask us. And one of them wasn't, did you share your faith? And yet, and I think that's not to say that obviously that's not ultimately important, but those things that are doing, caring for people because they're God's great creation, of hunger and thirst and being strangers and aliens and being prisoners or being sick, et cetera, et cetera. Those are things worth doing because we're followers of Christ. and we let God take the conversation from there. That because I think what happens when people are recipients or observers of undeserved mercy and grace, they always ask two questions, either out loud or to themselves. But who are you, and why are you doing this? Those are the two questions people ask. And I found that permission to go further in evangelism comes um, from curiosity and questions. That when God enters a conversation, there's always a curiosity on the part of the other person. Tell me why you're doing this again. Who are you guys? So it's the woman at the well that just peppers Jesus with questions. Nicodemus that keeps asking questions to him. And I think that's a good note to have, is that when God enters a conversation, it's always the earmarks or curiosity and question. The person says, this makes me uncomfortable. Talk about this. You stop the conversation. So yesterday I was taking the grandkids over to a great swim park and amusement park, and I'm reading a book on a digital ministry. Okay, so this guy sits down next to me at the swimming pool. I said, "What are you reading?" Oh, I said, and just told him what it was. The book on how to do this. And then that got it. Well, what's it about? And so I tell him. Then if I ask him a question, are you involved in any church? He said, no, I probably ought to be, but no. And as I dug deeper, and he asked me more questions about the digital, hybrid ministry. I mean, even though he'd never found out later, he'd never ever been to church. But the curiosity and questions gave me, as I left him, I said, you mentioned that you might want to start going to church. I would just say, investigate Jesus, who he was. And it was the most natural thing in the world. Wasn't push on him, because I just suspect that God was involved in the conversation because of the questions he kept asking me. And that was the curiosity there. So I think what happens, and truthfully, Ruth, you know as well as I do, it's not like you have a whole bunch of Christians that are now currently sharing their faith, and that when they start doing good deeds, it's going to take them away from evangelism. It just seems to be the
Right.
opposite. Is that one thing I find myself saying is that good deeds most of the time create goodwill. Wow, I didn't know Christians cared about that. Wow, I didn't. Wow, this all 300 people from your church were doing this. Wow, I didn't. That's awesome. Good deeds create goodwill, and in that spirit of goodwill, there's never a better atmosphere for actually having a spiritual conversation. And that was 99% of churches either strongly agreed with that.
I agree. I was going to say there was a few things that you mentioned that kind of sparked in my brain just from my experience too, but that ulterior motive versus ultimate motive. Um, I think it's interesting how sort of we can unintentionally create sort of a sense of a ROI, like what's my return on investment? And it becomes a transactional relationship, and we start out thinking that we want relationships that are loving, right? That I'm doing this because I love people, or I love the world, or Jesus loves the world. But love doesn't come in the form of a transaction. It comes in the form of knowing despite, right? An unconditional love, an unconditional showing up for you despite. The interesting thing that I think gets kind of messy with it is, if people know, like, if my ROI, if my return on investment, if I'm expecting someone to get saved and know Jesus, or if I'm expecting even them to, my ROI is like, you need to complete this program we're doing, or you need to like get better in some way, shape, or form. It all feels transactional, and the other person feels like a project. They feel like a transaction rather than a person. And we don't mean to do that, but that's how it's experienced,
Ruth,
right?
I just say delete all this podcast and just repeat the last 2 minutes what you said. Because what you said is so profound that the definition of love can never be transactional. I'm doing this so that. I mean, right? I mean, when we think of
Right.
that word agape, it's counter to everything that word says, as far as looking for an
Right.
ROI, and which should give us a little insight of why we do what we do and how we do it without any expectation. And Jesus said it. He said, no man comes to the Father. Or, I'm sorry, no one can come to me unless the Father draws him. So it's God
Mhm.
drawing them, but then what can we do to remove that friction? There's that great other verse in Acts
Right.
15 that says we determined not to make it difficult for those who are turning to God from among the
Yes.
Gentiles. And what that means is
Yeah.
reducing the friction of people coming to Christ. What are all the barriers them coming to Christ? But what can we do? What tools can we create? How can we live our lives? Whatever that reduce that friction. That when somebody wants to, they don't have all these barriers. Well, that means I need to become part of this political leaning. It means that we need, become a Christian. I need to become, you know. But you just let God draw all who He will to Christ, and make that most attractive.
Right.
And when they picture themselves becoming a
Right.
Christian, they picture themselves actually making a difference in the world too, not just aligning with a certain
Right.
theological, belief.
Right. Yep. And so like with that too, my experience has been, so I mean, I feel like I've worked with all kinds of people who aren't believers, some people who would consider themselves
Yeah.
Buddhists or atheists or and it's interesting because their perception often of the church is like you're only in it if you get what you want. Otherwise, you really are not at the table caring about the things that like human beings care about, that are hurting them, that are causing pain, or what I my like theological words, the vandalism of shalom in their life, right? Like shalom or wellness, wholeness is being vandalized and ripped apart, and you don't really care about that. You just kind of care about where they're going to spend eternity, which of course is super important, um, but they don't even see it like that. It's just you just care about your agenda, right? But literally as soon as a person shows up and is just like, hey, how can I be a part of this table and help support what you guys care about? Like where are people hurting? I mean, it's just like crazy where it's almost like this, like the church wants to get involved. The church wants to, like the church is going to put
Yeah.
resources towards this.
It's
The church
crazy.
is going to show up, and it's like this like crazy enthusiasm almost. And like, I mean, I've had people from who are completely atheists who are like, Ruth, I will do anything you need me to help get the church involved if you think that they want to get involved. And so there's like this sense of like, I think even we can often feel like there's a hostility towards the church from the world. And sometimes, of course, sometimes there is. But more often than not, I found if I like enter the setting and just say, hey, I'm representing the church and we just want to like see what we can do to participate in what you care about, the response is not even close to being stiff-armed or any kind of adversarial. It's like welcoming arms. And so I'm sure, I mean, again, you've seen this across the United States and across the world, but I feel like that's what the church wants to be, this like fragrance, this aroma of love and of salvation to the world. And I feel like in removing barriers, that's like one of the most crucial things we can do, right?
Yeah, and maybe that's it. Maybe that's we just stumbled across something there, Ruth, about removing barriers. It's like I think inherently because of the way God made us, people want to be connected with God. And we put so many barriers for them doing so. It's not a matter of convincing them of spiritual truth. I think this is just my hypothesis. But what if we just began removing all the barriers to them coming to Christ? And a lot of the barriers we put up ourselves,
Right. Yeah.
individually.
Unintentionally, I think. Yep, yep. And sometimes it isn't intentional. We think we're engaging for good, but it has been amazing to me. I mean, just like your surveys showed, I think with all these churches who are, when they start showing up with kind of open hands and no ulterior motive in the community, except for to love the community and to bring good and blessing, the community responds. Like it connects with a part of our, because we all feel like things aren't the way that they're supposed to be. I don't know anybody alive who has escaped that reality. Like life is not the way it's supposed to be. And there's a lot of people who want to your point, even with millennials, who want to participate in like, how do we get involved with making it the way it's supposed to be? And if we can be that connector point of between the gospel and like the real the real life giving presence of Jesus being infused into that, I just think, man, anyways, I get really excited about the possibilities, right?
There's a guy named Phil Butler who wrote a book called Better Together. And what he does, if you just read the book or see him on YouTube or whatever, but he makes a distinction between partnering. So some people say, well, how can we work with these other denominations, or how can we work with secular people when the Bible tells us not to be yoked unequally with unbelievers? What does light have to do with darkness and blah, blah, blah. But he makes a distinction between partnerships and partnering. And I think partnering is, it's a little bit, it kind of takes us back to platforms, is that platforms, like you can have all types of books on Amazon in their book section. I mean, books about following Christ and pornography side by side. They share a common platform, but it doesn't mean that we endorse each other in everything we believe. But together, this is the best place for people to find us. And so it's the same thing as far as so Phil makes a great distinction between about 5 levels of partnering and partnerships all the way to partnerships. But again, it's if we commonly care about things. So there's a term for it. It's called co-belligerency. So you can have feminists and evangelical churches both being against pornography, even though they together don't share anything. They have a kind of a common enemy, and you can have the same thing for a common good. And again, you don't come together because you hold the same worldview. I remember I was at Chuck Swindoll's old church. He had gone away from the church, but his first is Evangelical Free Church of Fullerton. And I was speaking out there and on kind of externally focused stuff. And next week, a pastor sent me a picture, and it was a picture of at the time it was World AIDS Day, and there was a big rally at Cal State Fullerton, and it was packed with people. All had signs. So right next to is one sign, First Evangelical Church of Fullerton, marching alongside another group that said Orange County Pagans and Witches Meet Up. So here they are. Why are they together? They have a different worldview, different theology, but they both care about people that are dying of HIV/AIDS. And that's a great picture of we're together because we both want this to happen, or we do want this positive thing to happen, but it doesn't mean we all, because we're in the same room, oh, you guys must believe all the same thing. People are much more sophisticated these days to think that just because we're in the, we sign the same petitions that we believe the same things, fundamentally about faith.
That's a good point.
One word I really like, Ruth, and this is more with maybe working with other believers, but the Apostle Paul used a great little phrase that he calls co-workers or co-laborers. And so he uses it, he calls Priscilla and Aquila, my fellow workers. A guy named Urbanus, our fellow worker. Timothy, my fellow worker. We're your co-workers, he says. We're your fellow workers. And Titus, he's my companion and fellow worker. Epaphroditus is my fellow worker. Clement and the rest of my fellow workers. And but a couple more. Timothy, yes, Timothy again. Aristarchus, Demas, and Luke are my fellow workers. Therefore, we ought to show hospitality to such men, so that we may be fellow workers with them for the truth. And that word "fellow workers," it's the word synergia, from which we get the word synergy. And synergy is always 1 + 1 = more than 2. That you and I partnering together can have better results than your individual efforts and my individual efforts, but when we come together, adding strength to each other's strengths. It's synergy. It comes from that word fellow workers, that co-worker thing. So it's not just we have the same job, but how can you structure things in your community that you could say, but not just believers, but imagine you being with your, arm in arm with the mayor of Atlanta saying we're co-workers, we're fellow workers. We add to each other, their endorsement of us helps us get better. Our co-laboring with them helps make them better, So I think it's a good, so it's the idea of 1 + 1 = more than 2. And who would want to, that Ecclesiastes, 2 are better than 1. They get a better return for their labor. how can one stand alone? So I think, we ought to be, if I had a choice of what verse to build a city network or city transformational movement around, I would do the one who's ever not against us is for us. Assume everyone is for the good of the city. They can be partners rather than, well, unless you can sign this doctrinal statement, we're on our own.
That's good. That's so good. So can you, we're talking collaboration and we're talking about synergy, right? Like accomplishing more
Yeah.
than anyone can do on their own. Can you, you've shared a couple of really cool sort of vignettes and stories, but can you just share even one or two cities that you've seen outside of Atlanta, like across the United States, where you've seen people collaborating across sectors and accomplish something pretty incredible? And just sort of the gospel transformational effect that it's happening in a couple of different communities.
Yeah, I think we both know Ian Stevenson out in Costa Mesa, and he runs a network called Trellis, and he's in the city of Costa Mesa, and they have, I like the way it was organized. So there's 60 churches in Costa Mesa, and 40 of them are involved in Trellis. And Trellis is such a great illustration because it's where all things can kind of grow. But since they've started forming, probably about 7 or 8 years ago, they collaboratively work together and then working with the city and working with government and everything else, but they are the catalyst to this, have taken 500 people off the streets and put them into permanent housing. And that's just huge. That's just 40 churches that had that as a focus, and they still do a daily. They staff it with the churches of Costa Mesa, but a daily food distribution thing for the most people that are most in the margins. But I think that's that changes a person's life when they get housing. Both of us know Rob Kelly and those folks over in Charlotte. But during the pandemic, so Rob at the time, the For Charlotte Network had somewhat over 300 churches involved in it that were part of For Charlotte. And so when the pandemic hit, the mayor only could think of one person to call that could mobilize the churches of Charlotte. And so he called Rob, and they started this thing called Charmac Response. So they're in Mecklenburg County, Charmac, I guess, Mecklenburg County and Charlotte. And they asked Rob to kind of head it up. So in the course of the pandemic, they had over 32,000 volunteers. They took care of 10,000 children or frontline workers. They handed out 4 million meals, 2 million masks. What other crazy stuff did they do? But 98% of those volunteers came from the network that were in Fort Charlotte. So what we say in this world is that it's easier to add a cause to a network than it is a network to a cause. It's like they say the best time to plant a tree is 10 years ago, of course, and then the second best time is today. But if the network's in place, then when disaster strikes or opportunity strikes, that the church is ready to respond. Right before your call, I had to get off another call because there was a great group that really wants to help bring the gospel to different areas. And I asked him how it was going. He said, well, the church is all fragmented. The churches aren't working with each other. But the place where they are working is where a network already exists, where the unity is already there. And so one of the things that we say in this world is it's easier to add, like I think I just said that, a cause to a network than a network to a cause. Like you can have the greatest cause, but if the church is not unified, you can't do anything. So unity, it seems to be, and church unity seems to be really core, the first step in being a transformational agent in the community.
And that's incredible. I'm thinking, I feel like for a small church, it seems like an easy win, right? Like a small church, there's no small church who could accomplish feeding that many people, right? Or handing out. But honestly, there is no real large church probably who could do that kind of a capacity. But I'm curious if you've seen, even when it's like outside of that kind of disaster relief
Yeah.
kind of things, have you seen an impetus or a motivation for larger churches to get involved with a collaborative work rather than, because,
Yeah.
it can feel, I mean, part of it can feel like we have a lot of resources, we can move faster on our own, we have our plan and that kind of a thing. But what have you seen there as far as like larger churches getting involved with
I wish
collaboration?
I had better stories to tell. I think my best story is yours. I mean, I think, do you go to Perimeter?
I don't go to Perimeter.
Whoops, okay, cut this part out then. But
Yep.
but Perimeter in Atlanta is the only. There may be many others. I don't want to negate that, but a mega church that can work collaboratively with the other churches in the community. But that was their whole model to begin with. The perimeters, they wanted to do church planting all around the perimeter of Atlanta, and it became working collaboratively with all the churches around the perimeter of Atlanta to help change Atlanta. But it's often difficult, just like you say, for those reasons that big mega churches feel like we don't need to collaborate with anybody. It's just so much easier, so much faster just to go alone. But I think there's something too about taking that extra time to work together to make it happen. So, I was thinking, Ruth, too, because this whole thing is about, I take it, your podcast, some of it's about community transformation, right?
Yes.
So I'll define, so people say, what exactly are we talking about? City transformation. I'll say it's really the integration of the good news and good deeds of Jesus that results in spiritual and societal transformation. And so, if you look at the good news, the integration of good news and good deeds, my kind of favorite integration verse is Acts 10:36, where Peter was describing the ministry of Jesus to the household of Cornelius, the first Gentiles. And it said, God preached the good news through Jesus, and Jesus, anointed with the Spirit, went about doing good. So here you have this wonderful collaboration of good deeds and good news. And the interesting thing is every time he did a good deed, it's not recorded that he preached good news, and vice versa, But the rhythm of his life was this good news and good deeds. And that's kind of the rhythm of our lives, the rhythm of the church too. And so it's the integration of good news and good deeds that results in spiritual and societal transformation. So what's the end goal? Spiritual transformation is when, seeing an increasing number of people that are learning to love the Lord their God with all their heart, their soul, mind, and strength. And then societal transformation would be an increasing number of people that are practically learning to love their neighbors as themselves, in practical ways. And so sometimes these city transformation things, they're kind of seen on the periphery of the church, but really it's central to when Jesus said, what's the most important thing we can do is love God and love our neighbors as ourselves. And so that's not peripheral, that's central. So if a city transformational movement can be built around those things, and your measurements become, are we seeing more people come to faith? And are we seeing an increasing number of people that are loving their neighbors in practical ways? Then you kind of have a couple of scorecards.
I have a 4-year-old, and I think, he is one of the primary impetuses for me to think about what's the world he's going to inhabit? Yeah. How is he going to engage in the world around him? But also living in communities where there has been, every community has a significant lack of flourishing in some way, shape, or form, right? Sure. It can take on different faces, but seeing communities that are experiencing such a lack of flourishing and knowing that really just getting involved in some real physical ways in the community can make a huge difference on the way that they even understand and experience God in the world. And so yeah, he's I was motivated long before I had him, but it does create an extra sort of practical, tangible sort of motivation of what community do I want him to exist in, and how am I helping him to grow into the person who's going to contribute to making it a community where everybody can thrive.
Wow.
And
And
so,
what an interesting way to phrase that. How can he be a contributor? You need to say recipient, but how do you raise a child to be a contributor like that? Hey Ruth, I know that we don't have too much time, but should we talk about the Harvard Flourishing Study?
yeah, please, please. I would love for you to talk
Okay,
about
yes,
that.
this is so good because when we look at what a city, when we look at we camp out sort of in Isaiah 61. We say when God has a chance to build a city from scratch, what does that city look like? So in Isaiah 61 verses 17 through 25, God outlines what the new Jerusalem is going to be like. And whatever he wants a city to be, if he can design a city from scratch and he can tell you what it's going to be, it kind of gives us some benchmarks of what we ought to be shooting for. So he says it's a place where its people are a joy, you know. It says it says that people have health and longevity. It says that there's no babies that die. It says people live long lives. If a person dies at 100, they're still considered young. It says that people are satisfied with the work of their hands. There's employment, there's meaningful work for every person in the community. It says that people dwell together in generations. The family structure is intact. It says that before they call, I will answer. There's collective prayer. There's a spiritual community in its place. And I might have left out a couple things, but the last one, it says the wolf will lie down with the lamb. And I think that's a picture of reconciliation between two people that were enemies that are now friends and live in peace together. It represents a lack of violence. So those things can actually be a scorecard for your current city, and and also you can kind of give yourself a report card and then kind of figure out what you can do to make things better in those areas. Well, in 2016, I think, there's a guy named Tyler Vanderweel at Harvard. They started the Harvard Flourishing Program. And they studied people all over the world, and then recently just got a $42 million grant to work with Baylor to interview 250,000 people around the world. But they've identified kind of 5 outcomes of human flourishing. And they have to do with happiness and life satisfaction. And it looks just like Isaiah 61. Happiness and life satisfaction, emotional and physical health, quality of relationships, meaning and purpose, character and virtue, meaning and purpose, and I think financial well-being. But the most interesting thing is those are the outcomes of flourishing. But there's an outcome of flourishing, but there's only 4 paths that lead to that flourishing. And surprise, and they kind of make sense. But the first is the family. There's my 4 leading to 5, but no, forget it. But family is the first one. So the family of origin really affects how you do in the 5 areas of flourishing. The second one is work. And the reason I like that one so much is that if managers and business owners could see themselves in the people development business as much as the paycheck writing business, we can see a really big difference. The 8 or 10 hours that you spend every day at work, what if those were you're learning things that you could take at home, be a better father, a better mother, a better parent, better partner? And the third area is education, obviously affects those things. But the big surprise is the last one of those 4 pathways to flourish, they've identified as religious communities. And so the one, I think that if you ever had to be a part of a favorite one, I'd say it's this one, because this not only affects the 5 areas of flourishing, but faith communities can also affect the families, marriage, how you raise your kids. They also have the ability to affect faith and work, how you bring your faith in the job. They can also think of church-school partnerships, education systems, after-school programs, 3rd grade reading level, stuff like that, as well as themselves. So quit trying to be the victim, church. And we are in the power seat for influence. We want to say, if you want to claim the victim card, you'll be a victim. But if you see yourself as, wow, there's only 4 agents of change that make a community prosper, and we own a 4th of them, and really the ability to influence the other 3 channels of influence, let's get off our butts and do something. Let's make that happen, right? And so I love that flourishing thing, especially how it fits in with Isaiah 61, that we're not the persecuted minority, that we actually can be the biggest change agent in the community.
And then when we partner together with others, it like scaffolds and just like explodes. It radiates out, right? And
Very good, Ruth.
yes,
That's exactly right.
I think that's a great place to end this.
What? Where's
Thank
the
you.
refreshments? Where's
I know.
that? Ruth, I can't tell you
Thanks
how
for
delightful
being
it is.
here.
I'm so glad. And I want to say, that there's two models of city transformation. One seeing the city as Babylon. And that's when God says, seek the peace and prosperity to the city that I've carried you. And the Babylonians had destroyed Jerusalem, carried them off captivity. And the counterintuitive, God says, seek the peace, the shalom of the city to which I've carried you. And I think that's a universal mandate. And pray to the Lord for it. So the two things are to seek the shalom, but then also be praying for our leaders, praying for our teachers, people that are all in those positions to make the city better. And and so there's two parts: actively seeking the shalom city, praying for it, and then it says, "For as it prospers, you too will prosper." So it's not as the church gets better, the communities get better. No, as the community gets better, the church can get better. As it becomes that key agent in it. And I actually had something good to say about that, Ruth. What else did I want to say? How do I want to conclude our time together? Oh, so maybe this is it, but this probably wasn't it, but I will say it. And we see so many more people your age. Oh, so the old model was, so that was you have the Babylon model or you have a Jericho model. The Jericho model is where we're enemies of the city, where we march around the strongholds to take down the forces that the enemy controls. And just how you see your city, whether you see it as a Jericho or a Babylon, determines the outcomes. Because if you're the enemies to your city, you will despise them. They will feel less than in your presence. They'll feel your scorn and your hatred and your just your just the bad stuff about you. And so I just suggest that if you're listening to this or you're part of what's happening in Atlanta or you're just listening from some other place or watching from another place, think of your city. What can you do to help it prosper? And what you can do to pray for it, not to bring it down. So that's my final word.
That's good.
Except for where are
That's
those
good.
refreshments? So thanks, Ruth. So
That's
good. So good to have you leading this movement and this. I know you got plenty of co-laborers with you there, but you are such a
absolutely.
spark plug there in Atlanta. So thank you.
I love it. I love it. And I think that is a powerful thing. And it transforms the interesting thing. And maybe I will leave with this is as I have lived and approached my city as Babylon or as a place where there's people who I want to both engage in and be engaged with by them, the more I've done that, the more my own life really has been transformed. The more I have been
And
expanded
it
as a
has
human
prospered. You
being.
too have prospered
Right, right.
individually.
And my even my view of God as I engage with people who don't know God, even my view of God has broadened and become more beautiful and more rich. And so I love that you ended it there because I think that really is the promise is that as we live out into the world for the good of others, we experience that good and that richness and that wealth in our own lives. And so okay, well, thank you. Thank you for what you're doing to empower and equip and like just bring so many of us together to think together and to be better together as we're seeking to do the work we're doing. I
It is kind
love
of fun.
the investment of your time and energy and the ripple effect that it's having into communities as we hopefully all are getting stronger and better ourselves. So thanks for taking the time with
Thank
us.
you, Ruth, so much for having me with you.